I must say that the story of beheading of John the Baptist is not one that I would automatically choose for a sermon, but then I don't choose the lectionary readings either. Its relevance in the overall context of today's reading is also puzzling. Why did Mark suddenly go back and tell us this story about John the Baptist? Perhaps the most obvious connection is the two parallels that can be drawn between Jesus and John on one hand and Herod and Pilate on the other. John and Jesus both died because influential political figures lacked the moral fibre to stand up and be counted and to do what they knew to be right. Herod and Pilate both did what was expedient. Herod Antipas was the son of Herod the Great, the ruthless king who was in power when Jesus was born, the very one who had the children of Bethlehem, the holy innocents, murdered because he feared that his power was going to be compromised. Herod Antipas sadly followed in his father's footsteps, began weaving his web of deceit at an early age, seeking to be named king. Instead, he was banished to Palestine, where he built his capital city at Tiberias. Later on, in a visit to Rome, Herod met Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. And so he murdered his brother Philip, divorced his own wife, and married Herodias before returning to Palestine together with her daughter. And it was here that John encountered them and issued judgment against them because of what they had done. And it was because of this public denouncement of their marriage that Herodias hated John and wanted him killed. But what was it about John that got to Herod? Herod must have sensed something of the truth in John's message. He must have known that John was the real article, and more importantly, that his message was true. John had been arrested by King Herod. And why? Because he kept reminding him that even the king was not above the law. And he was being told, it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. And this was the king's son. This is the king's sin. He had murdered his brother and stolen Herodias, his wife. And it could be understandable if the story finished there. On the face of it, appears that the king didn't like a desert preacher calling him a sinner, so he had him beheaded. Simple enough, but life isn't always simple. And there's usually more in a story that meets the eye. And in this case, we learn that Herod actually liked to listen to John. He thought he was a holy man. And perhaps in Herod's mind, putting him in a safe place under lock and key was a way of removing him from harm's way. And so even Herod at that time didn't think that it was enough to warrant death. But soon there was an easy way out. And Herod had called this great party, and there was much singing and dancing, and his daughter danced for him. And he promised her anything that she could desire. And when she was asked, she quickly went to see her mother and came back and asked for John's head. Now, it really was decision time for Herod. Could he back out of his promise and risk humiliation, or follow through and give her what she wanted? Claiming he couldn't go back on his word, Herod caved in. As readers of this story, we must ask ourselves if Herod's claims were true, and if his options were really what they claimed to be. Was he tricked into giving John the Baptist's head? Was he forced to give in to his daughter? Would his guests have turned on him or mocked him if he refused her? It all seems most unlikely. Who would offer something to a child and then follow through, no matter how unreasonable the demand? After all, Herod was the king. The power was his, and the power over his family was almost without being questioned. Herod held all the cards. And so why did he give in, knowing that his hand couldn't really have been forced? He knew John to have been a righteous and a holy man. And the truth is that Herod didn't fear John for who he was, but for the message that he brought. And he had been dazzled and probably intrigued by him. He didn't really want to hear the message, of course, because hearing the message would have meant changing his life. So in the end, it was easier to give in. And if he wanted to kill the message, what better way than to kill the messenger? So where do we fit into this story? Like John, we are the messengers, set with the task of spreading the good news that God is here and with us and with those that we meet. But like John, our truth-telling can come at a price. Under what conditions are we willing to speak up, set the record straight, or speak our minds? When we see injustice, as John saw, are we willing to speak up? How many nettles are we failing to grasp? Or do we just let them go because we feel our popularity will suffer? Or maybe it's just because we don't like making a fuss. The fact is, though, that we proclaim a message much, much bigger than the messenger. And sometimes, don't we just forget our role, acting like Herod, closing ourselves to the truth, turning away when we see injustice, suffering, abuse and hurt, instead of speaking up, ignoring those who would call our attention to what is going on around us? We shouldn't really fall into this trap. We must not be swayed from our role. We too are sent out like the disciples. And like John, we are messengers, messengers of the good news. And we shouldn't forget that. Amen.